She wasn't asking for special treatment, just a seat on a Chinook already scheduled for the eastern compound, but when she walked up with her gear bag, the crew chief brush-tied her roster was sealed. No addition, she backed away without argument. That's when a brigadier general spotted her, and went frigid not because of her insignia or service rec, but because of an emblem tucked on her collar, a mark from a squadron that never had official documentation. He marched over, uttered 3 words, and the entire airfield shifted into overdrive. Want to know what he said? And why it changed everything? Hit subscribe and tell, use in the comments what country you're watching from. Let's dive in. You know that sinking feeling when you enter somewhere and immediately feel like you don't belong. That's exactly what Forward Operating Base Sandstone felt like. If you didn't have the proper clearance or sport the right unit, patches a tactical staging area on the outskirts of Afghanistan, where every action was lightning fast and inquiries were deflected like incoming mortars. The atmosphere reeked of jet fuel and disappointment mixed with that, courses and an hydraulic fluid that sticks to your uniform for weeks. Chinook stood like sleeping giants across the landing zone, their blades motionless. While Apache circled overhead, the endless hum of power units merged with the rumble of logistics convoys returning from missions, creating a familiar soundtrack every warrior recognizes by instinct. The base sprawled across 10 acres of hard pandycert surrounded by razor wire and guard tower, manned by soldiers who'd seen too much and slept too little. Concrete barriers channeled traffic in zigzag patterns designed to stop vehicle bombs, while overhead cameras tracked every movement, every shadow, every gesture that might signal trouble. The command post, a fortified bunker crowned with communication arrays, pulsed with a steady rhythm of encrypted radio traffic, coordinates casualty reports, supply requests, an endless stream of military bureaucracy that kept the war machine grinding forward. Staff Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez stepped from the minimal shelter of a supply bunker gear bag draped over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. Her standard-issue jacket displayed no markings, no identification tags, just weathered camouflage and combat boots that had marched through battlefields. Too many to remember. She walked with that calculated precision refined by years of being precisely where duty demanded when circumstances required it. Most observers wouldn't detect the slight F over off her left ankle, a subtle compensation from an explosion in Kandahar. Had left injuries, she'd learned to work around old damage, old memories, the type you accommodate because stepping aside isn't acceptable for warrior. Elena had arrived at Sandstone 3 days earlier, on a routine rotation from Camp Leatherneck. Officially, she was there to conduct medical training for the 3rd Infantry Division's medics, but that was just cover paperwork to justify her presence. Their real reason was buried in classified files that most generals would never see. She'd been tracking a pattern of regular casualties from units operating in the Helmand provinces, soldiers dying from wounds that should have been survivable injuries that suggested someone was compromising medical protocols. From the inside, the morning had started like any other, at Sandstone Reveille to 5 Chowetzo 6/3, and the usual briefings that blended into white noise for most soldiers. But Elena had received something different, a coded message on her personal device, transmitted through channels that weren't supposed to exist anymore. The encryption was outdated, nearly ancient by military standard, but she recognized the signature immediately. Her old unit's emergency protocol activated. After years of silence, theme sage was brief cordon, 80s of frequency, and a single word, Phoenix, the same word that had gotten her into this life and might now be calling her back to face ghosts she'd spent years trying to forget. Elena had stared at the screen for a full minute before deleting the message, her training kicking in automatically, but the damage was done. The past was reaching out with bloody fingers, demanding attention. At the flight operations, 2 military police in fresh tactical vests stood watch beside the hangar, monitoring the Chinook as its turbines began their startup sequence. That distinctive whine built gradually, cutting through the desert atmosphere. The crew chief, a grizzled sergeant first class named Morrison, had been working helicopters for 15 years and had developed an instinct for trouble, has studied every passenger, every piece of cargo, every detail that might compromise his bird's safety. Elena approached with steady determination. No unnecessary movement. Good afternoon, soldiers. Staff Sergeant Vasquez requesting transport east on the casualty evacuation. I understand I'm not on the passenger list, but it's critical. Morrison looked up from his pre-flight checklist, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that keeps crews alive. Manifest complete. No standby passengers today. Orders from command. The first sentry, a young man who appeared barely past basing, didn't raise his gaze from his roster. Private Johnson from small-town Kansas still believed the world made senses, still thought rules mattered more than results. The second sentry, older but equally dismissive, interrupted her with a sharp gesture of his hand. Sergeant Williams, 20-year veteran, who'd stopped caring about anything except his retirement date regulations. Our regulations, Sergeant. Next transport leaves tomorrow. Possibly Elena accepted their refusal with Grace nodding once before withdrawing to a weathered equipment container just outside the commotion. The steel burned her hands, but she sat regardless, gear bag beside her boots, observing the controlled disorder with the patience of someone who'd waited in harsher locations for more important reasons. Behind her, woofers in spotless uniforms exchanged the type of conversation junior personnel engage in when they believe they understand everything. Look at their one remarked, voice audible over the engine noise. Lieutenant Chen from the 82nd Airborne, fresh from West Point, still believing war was about honor and glory. Bet she's never faced actual danger. His companion, Lieutenant Rodriguez from the same unit, laughed, probably some support staff seeking excitement. They all move like they've got steel rods for spines. Third Lieutenant Martinez nodded along, eager to fit in with his peers. These guys had been in country for 6 weeks and thought they understood combat. Elena heard every word, her grip on the gear bag strap tightened momentarily, but her expression remained unchanging. Decades of military service taught her that responses are decisions and some aren't worth the energy. The sentries waved the officers through without inspection, their pristine equipment, an arrogant demeanor apparently sufficient identification. Meanwhile, Elena sat in the scorching heat watching a helicopter that sec. Ode Preserva left, prepared to depart. Without her, their Ani wasn't lost on her that the same system she'd spent years serving now treated her like an outsider, a problem to be managed, rather than our source to be utilized. What they didn't realize was her mission. The transmission had arrived at sunrise on an encrypted frequency that shouldn't still operate. Status interference, a satellite delay, and a voices she'd trained years earlier. Sergeant Rodriguez, Miguel Rodriguez. She'd recognized him immediately. Intelligent soldier from Phoenix, steady nerves, the kind who questioned everything, but always followed through. Miguel had been part of her training group back in 2007, before the world went dark, before units like theirs ceased to exist on paper. What's your situation, Miguel? Not favorable, ma'am. Took shrapnel in the abdomen during an operation. Field medics stabilized me, but his voice weakened. I'm frightened. They're discussing surgical procedure. I don't understand. Need someone who gets it. Elena was already gathering supplies before he finished. You're requesting me specifically? Affirmative, ma'am, if it's feasible. I realize it's not standard. Miguel's call had triggered protocols Elena thought were dead, buried with the rest of Desert Phoenix when the program was officially terminated in 2009. But some bonds transcend paperwork, some promises survive, even when the organizations that created them disappear into classified archives. Miguel, I'll be there. No documentation, no authorization, just a promise made in darkness to her who needed her. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because what Elena didn't know was that she wasn't the only ghost. At Forward Operating Base Sandstone that day, the flight operations at Forward Operating Base Sandstone pulsed with its typical Tuesday intensity. Chinook rotors winning toward takeoff, MPs shouting over the grinding of equipment trucks, the sharp scent-off fuel mixing with dessert grit, and the distant aroma of coffee from the operations tent. Elena Vask sat on the scorched equipment container, her gear bag beside her feet. The sentry's rejection still echoing in the air, her standard janked to her body soaked with perspiration as the senior MP reinforced his position with a firm shake of his head. No, Space Sergeant, next rotation tomorrow. The two officers who'd ridiculed here earlier trotted past their crisp uniforms, earning them acknowledgement from the guards, while Elena's ankle throbbed more noticeably under the heat stress, a quiet reminder of the blast that had nearly claimed her. The crew dismissed her urgent request, reduced to a crumpled message in the younger guard's clipboard. Here positioned her gear bag, the weight pulling at their shoulder where fragments had left a ragged scar concealed beneath the fabric. The lieutenant's mockery persisted as they lingered nearby. Bet she's never seen real combat. Chen said, voice carrying over the rotor sound, probably Adesk warrior playing soldier. Rodriguez added a blocked the mouth her thoughts, returning to the Kandahar evening, where that injury had earned her amble noon could wear. Cher remembered that night with crystalline clarity, the taste of copper in her mouth from biting her tongue during the explosion, the smell of burning flesh and metal, the screams of wounded soldiers, echoing across the desert floor. Desert Phoenix had been called in to extract our reconnaissance team that had stumbled into a Taliban stronghold. 12 American soldiers strapped in a compound, surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain better than any GPS system could map. Elena had been the door gunner on the lead bird, providing covering fire, while the extraction rappelled into hell. The flight operations continued, radio crackling, boots scrapings, but the atmosphere felt more oppressive. With each insult, the Nasho moved, ignition servicing a nearby. Apache stopped, his eyes catching the edge of her collarless head just at her jacket. Technical Sergeant Davis recognized something in that faded emblem, something that made his hands shake. Escher turned to his work. Elena barely noticed. Their attention focused on the Chinook's pre-flight procedures. The lieutenants, joined by Martinez, escalated their taunts, probably bought that gear from a surplus store. Martinez said, leaning against a crate now at patch, "Not credentials, just a pretender." Their laughter attracted a small gathering of crew and guards feeding off the security of rank. What none of them realized was that their voices were carrying further than they thought, and someone with the authority to change everything had been listening from the command post's observation deck. That's when the flight operations rhythm faltered. A figure emerged from the command center, his uniform, pressed silver stars gleaming in the brutal light. Brigadier General David Kane moved with the purposeful stride of a man who'd accumulated years in combat zone, his weathered faces scanning the situation. Kane was 48 years old, a career soldier who'd risen through the ranks on merit and blood. He'd commanded units in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that didn't appear on any official maps. The lieutenants straightened their smirks, disappearing. Kane's eyes narrowed as Elena shifted to stand, her jacket moving to reveal a small Velcro emblem on her collar. Desert Tana Crimson Eagle with a lightning bolt beneath it, faded, but unmistakable. The crowd stilled, the air thickening with unspoken significance. Kane stepped closer, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hold position," he said, his tone carrying the authority of command. The MP paused, the lieutenants froze, and Elena turned, her expression unreadable. Kane's gaze locked on the emblem, his jaw clenching. "That symbol," he said, almost to himself. "Desert Fan. IX-08 Kandahar." The flight operation held its breath, the dust seeming to settle. Ash's story loomed large. But what happened next would change everything, because General didn't just recognize the patch. He had been there that night in Kandahar when everything went wrong, and he owed his life to the woman standing before him. The flight operations at Forward Operating Base Sandstone stood frozen in tense silence, the desert sun blazing down, as Brigadier General David Kane fixed his attention on the faded emblem. On Elena Vasquez's collar, a crimson eagle with a lightning bolt, its descent threads speaking of on it that never officially existed. The lieutenants Martinez, Rodriguez, and Chen stiffened, their earlier mockery evaporating like vapor under the heat. MPs and crew members froze, mid-action radios falling silent, the Chinook's rotor whine fading into the background. Elena straightened her gear bag, still beside her feet, their expression a mixture of determination and quiet dignity. Kane stepped closer, his voicey but laced with memory. "Kandahar 08, he said, his eyes tracing the emblem's warned as Desert Phoenix, extracted my platoon from an ambush, insurgents closing in a close air support. You were on that bird." Elena nodded, once her measured door gunner covered the withdrawal while you evacuated the wounded. Kane's mind flashed back to that night, 18 months into his deployment, when he'd been a lieutenant. NT Colonel commanding a forward reconnaissance unit that had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. The air thickened heavy with a history. The young officers couldn't grasp. Kane's jaw tightened, his mind flashing to the chaos. 6 men wounded, 18 trapped, and a phantom team cutting an escape route through enemy lines. He remembered the sound of Elena's machine gun chattering from the helicopter's door, the muzzle flashes illuminating her determined face, as she laid down suppressive fire that kept the Taliban from overrunning their position here. He remembered the way she'd ignored the bullets winning, past their head, focused only on keeping his soldiers alive long enough for the extraction to succeed. That eagle murmured, "No records, no personnel files, just shadows, deep black operations." The flight operation shush deepened, the crowd exchanging nervous glances. The lieutenants shifted their taunts, a distant memory. Kane remembered the after-action report he'd tried to write, praising the helicopter crew that had saved his unit, their port that had been classified above his clearance level, the commendations that had disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, the names that had been scrubbed from Officia. "LR." Kane turned sharply, his voices leasing the air. "I need the flight commander now." An MP corporal sprinted toward the hangar, returning with Major Thompson, who saluted sharply. Sir Thompson was a competent officer, but he'd never served in units where the rules were suggestions, and survival was the only metric that mattered. Kane didn't wuss 2 words. "This is Staff Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, Desert Phoenix, Kandahar 08. She provided cover under black protocol, full authorization, full access. Get her on that Chinook, no questions. That's an order." Thompson's eyes flicked to the emblem, understanding dawning across his face. He'd heard whispers about Desert Phoenix, late-night conversations between senior officers who'd sworn oaths they couldn't break. "It's here," he snapped, motioning to the crew. "Load here equipment." Now the lieutenants whispered among themselves. "Desert Phoenix." Martinez muttered, "Never heard of it." Thompson overheard, his tone cold enough to freeze. "Deserts. Saying you wouldn't classified beyond your clearance level. That unit saved more lives than you'll ever know, gentlemen." Elena's gear bag was rushed to the helicopter, the crew moving with renewed urgency. Morrison, the crew chief, personally supervised the loading, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional respect. Martinez approached, his head lowered. "Ma'am, you apologized, didn't know your background." Alina's gaze was steady, but not unkind. "You didn't inquire," she said, the words a quiet lesson in humility, rather than rebuke. He nodded, humbled, understanding that he just learned something important about respect and assumptions. "I will next time, ma'am." She gave a slight nod, letting the moment register. Kane walked her to the ramp, the flight operations resuming its rhythm, but transformed forever. "Note a favor," he said quietly. "Obligation." Elena paused at the helicopter's edge, looked back at the general, who had recognized her worth even when the system hadn't. "Thank you, sir, for remembering." Kane's salute was sharp and respectful. "Some things you never forget. Sergeant, especially debts that can never be paid." As she boarded the general's salute day gesture that rippled through the observers. By nightfall, the story would read Elena, the ghost with the hidden emblem. Gen confirmed, but also a reminder that heroes don't always wear their medals on their chests. The crew chief Morrison helped her secure her gear, his demeanor completely changed from the dismissive professional he'd been minutes earlier. "Ma'am, if you don't mind asking, what was it like serving with Desert Phoenix?" Elena considered the question carefully. "We did what needed to be done," she said simply, "when the official channels couldn't or wouldn't." Morrison nodded, understanding that some questions don't have easy answers. Some missions exist in the spaces between what's legal and what's necessary inside the Chinook. The familiar vibration of pre-flight surrounded her, her mind on Miguel Rodriguez waiting east with an abdominal wound. The aircraft lifted off, carrying her to a soldier who needed her, the emblem Massillon to Ath kept in the shadows. But this story isn't over yet, because when Elena arrived at that eastern compound, what she found would test everything she thought she knew about loyalty duty and the ghosts that haunt the shadows of war. As the helicopter climbed into the desert sky, Elena closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. Kandahar, 2008, the night that had changed everything, the night that had forged bonds stronger than blood and deeper than official recognition. She thought about Mig waiting for her, scared and hurt, a place where official channels had failed him. Again, she thought about the system that had created soldiers like them and then abandoned them when the politics changed. She thought about the price of service and the weight of promises made in darkness. Want to know what happened when she reached Miguel and why her arrival would spark a chain of events that would expose his secrets the military had buried for over a decade. Hit that notification bell, because the next chapter of this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the hidden wars our soldiers fight in silence and the bonds that survive, even when the units that forged them disappear into classified archives.